Okay, welcome everybody. This is our first podcast in a series that will cover the entire term. And what we want to address today is the human organism. And what we'll be talking about is essentially the map of the human body, some terms that are important to know regarding locations of organ systems and different body regions. And we'll also be discussing the distinction between anatomy and physiology, and we'll talk a bit about homeostasis. So, anatomy is a science that looks at the body's structure, essentially uh, where something is, what it looks like, um, and as we'll see, anatomy can be broken down into both macroscopic anatomy, which are structures that are visible with the naked eye, and microscopic anatomy, where we study components of living systems such as cells and tissues that are only possible to visualize and characterize using a device called a microscope. Physiology is the scientific investigation of the process or the function of living things, and what we have to understand about anatomy and physiology is they go hand in hand. Anatomy describes structure and location and gives you an idea of where things are in relation to other structures or organs, while physiology tells you the purpose of that structure. So, in this in the course of the next 15 weeks, whenever we talk about a body system, you should immediately ask yourself a series of questions. Number one, uh, what is this um, organ system, tissue, or cell? Where would I find it? What does it look like? And then from the physiology standpoint, what does it do? Okay, so if you can answer those questions, you'll go a long way in being successful in the study of anatomy and physiology. So, gross or macroscopic anatomy are structures that are examined without a microscope, and these include regional anatomy that studied area by area, systemic anatomy that studied system by system, and surface anatomy where external form and relation to deeper structures is examined, as in X-ray, anatomical imaging, CRT, MRI, and so forth. So what do we mean by each of these terms? Well, in regional, what we might look at, say, is thoracic anatomy, and we would be interested in that case the structures of organs such as the lungs and the heart and the great vessels that attach to the heart, the trachea, the larynx, and so on, the upper digestive and the upper respiratory, just to name a few things that you'd find in the thoracic region. Systemic would be looking at different body systems, okay, things like the endocrine system, where we would examine the anatomy of the endocrine organs, such as the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the adrenals, the thyroid, the thymus, the pancreas, the gonads, and so on. And surface anatomy, uh, where we would look at external structures in their relation to deeper structures. So, for instance, we might be interested in the surface anatomy of the forearm, okay? And what we'd have to understand about the shape of the forearm is that it's governed by components that lie beneath the superficial aspect, which is the part that you can immediately see with the naked eye, such as the musculature, the bones and the cartilage, the tendons and ligaments, and so on. Microscopic anatomy are structures that can only be visualized with an instrument called a microscope, and this includes disciplines such as cytology, where we examine cellular anatomy, and histology, which is the study of tissues, which are collections of cells that have a similar structure and function that do a particular task for the body. Now, physiology reveals the dynamic nature of living things, and it considers the operations of specific organ systems. Cell physiology will examine processes that take place inside cells, things such as transport and metabolism, when and where cells grow. Neurophysiology, as another example, focuses on the nervous system, and cardiovascular physiology examines the functioning of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. There are disciplines that encompass both anatomy and physiology as an integrated discipline. Pathology studies the structural and functional changes that are caused by disease. The prefix patho means of or pertaining to disease. And exercise physiology examines the changes in structure and function that are caused by exercise. An exercise physiologist, as an example, would be interested in, for instance, the change in the utilization of fuel by muscle during exertion, and also would be interested in the change in muscle structure that takes place over periods of repeated exercise. So they would be examining conditions such as the hypertrophy of muscle when we engage in resistance training, and also perhaps the metabolic pathways that allow that to happen, both anabolic and catabolic. So one of the things that scientists like to do when they address any discipline is they like to categorize important information to make it more useful. And the reason for this is that when you put things in categories, it makes it easier, based on the assignment to a particular category, to immediately assign certain characteristics to the items that are in that class. As an example, we can take the daily mail. Okay, you get mail probably every day. Some of it might be bills, some of it might be personal correspondence, some of it might be advertisements, and if you were to simply put all that mail in one spot, and it were incumbent on you to find, let's say, a letter from a particular friend, you'd have a difficult task in front of you, because you'd have to sort through every piece of mail in order to find that piece of correspondence. Whereas if you had categorized your mail according to specific characteristics by putting all the bills in one stack and all the advertisements in another stack and all the personal correspondence in another stack, it would be much easier for you to locate that particular piece of correspondence. By the same token, if you had sorted your mail in that fashion and you were to reach into the stack of bills, you would know immediately, without looking at the item that you picked out of the stack, that it is something that you've either paid or have to pay, and it's generally something that you probably put a premium of importance on. And so scientists do the same thing when they categorize different components of structure and function. They put collections of objects into a group based on certain characteristics, and then when we know that a particular item in a group has those characteristics, we immediately know a lot more about it without having to extensively study it, reinvent the wheel, so it were. And this makes the data a lot more manipulable and a lot more useful. So here we're looking at an example of the structural and functional organization of living systems, and we start at the chemical level, where we have the interactions of atoms with each other, and as we know, everything in the universe is either matter or energy. Here we're looking at the smallest building block of matter, which is the atom. Collections of atoms are put together to form molecules, and collections of molecules become macromolecules. And collections of macromolecules can form functional units inside cells that are called organelles. Collections of organelles together form the smallest unit of living matter, which is the cell, and it's the structural and functional unit of all living organisms, while tissues are collections of cells that have a particular set of characteristics that act together as a group to serve the organism very effectively. The organ level is where one or more tissues function together to serve a particular physiological purpose for the organism, and of course the organ systems act together to perform a wide variety of tasks that keep the organism alive, and the organism is the highest level of organization in this particular hierarchy, and this is the actual living thing itself. And so if we were to take any point in this hierarchy, let's say that we pulled an organ out of a living organism. Let's say we pulled a kidney out. What could we immediately say about that organ? Well, we would know that it's made up of one or more tissues functioning together, and we would find, if we were to examine the kidney as an organ, that we would find epithelial tissue, we would find connective tissue, and we would find muscle tissue, all acting together to perform a particular task. In the case of the kidney, one of its functions is to clean the blood. It also helps to maintain the body's pH, and it also has a role in maintaining blood pressure and blood volume. All of this is very important to keeping the organism alive. If we were to look at the tissues that make up the kidney, we would find that they are groups of cells that perform particular tasks. The epithelial tissue is very good at lining the internal or external surfaces of portions of the organ to form barriers between one part of the organ and another. And sometimes these barriers are capable of secretion and absorption. That's one of the hallmarks of epithelial tissue. We would find that there's smooth muscle tissue that's important in internal movement inside the organ. And we would find connective tissue that's vital in holding the other tissues together. And in the case of the liquid connective tissue known as blood, we would find that there are other important functions served by this tissue, such as the ability to deliver nutrients and oxygen to the living tissues of the body, a way to regulate the body's temperature, a way to remove waste products, and also a way to maintain the body's pH. So all of that we would get out of looking at the tissues. If we were to look at an individual tissue, we would find that it's made up of cells that all have a similar set of characteristics that do a particular job very well. For instance, if we were to look at the smooth muscle inside the kidney, we would find that it is very good at moving components through the organ. Okay, the smooth muscle, for instance, in the middle layer of the blood vessels is helpful in controlling the perfusion of the organ. The smooth muscle tissue that is in the kidney tubules helps to control the transport of blood filtrate through the organ, just as a couple of examples. And then if we were to look at the cells that make up these tissues, if we were to look at the cells themselves, we would find that they are collections of organelles, which themselves are collections of macromolecules, all of which perform very important specialized tasks for the organism. Okay, so you can see how we can start anywhere in this hierarchy, and we can move down the hierarchy and immediately know these things without necessarily knowing the specifics. So that's the the power that goes with categorizing things. Now this is just a quick map of the organs of the body. So this is a way to orient you as to some of the locations of the vital organs. If we start at the top, you can see here the brain, which sits inside the cranial cavity. The brain is an integrator of electrical stimulus that comes to it from a collection of structures known as the peripheral nervous system. Um, these electrical sensations are produced as the result of the interaction of the body with stimuli. These stimuli are converted into electrical information that is sent from the peripheral nerves to the spinal cord, which is right here, up to the brainstem and up to the brain. The brain then integrates these stimuli, categorizes them, and then decides what it is we want to do about this set of stimuli, and then these motor commands are sent from the brain to the brainstem to the spinal cord to the peripheral nerves, and then out to the effectors, which are the organs or tissues that are going to carry out the command, and then we are able to react to our environment. Moving down, you can see the larynx or voice box, which is part of the upper respiratory system. Underneath it, the trachea. These are the primary bronchi. These are the lungs. This is where gas exchange takes place in the body. This is where we swap carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas, for oxygen, which is important because it's oxygen's delivery to the cells that allows the cells to make enough usable energy to remain alive. You can see the heart here, which is of course the blood pump, and you can see a few of the great vessels. This one is the aorta, okay, which delivers oxygenated blood to all um, the, the cells in the body. The aorta branches many times to form other arteries and arterioles and capillaries, and this is how we get oxygen and nutrients to all the tissues in the body. And you can see below the heart and the lungs is the diaphragm, which is the muscle of breathing. It also serves as a major dividing line between the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. This is the abdominal pelvic cavity. This is the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm, when it contracts, produces a vacuum around the inside of the lungs that sit inside the closed gas-filled chamber that is the thoracic cavity. The lungs, as a result of this vacuum being produced by the contraction of the diaphragm, will expand. This pulls air into the lungs, and this air is rich in oxygen. The oxygen will diffuse into the blood across the alveoli of the lungs while the carbon dioxide diffuses out, and that's how we get oxygen to every cell in the body. Below the diaphragm you can see the liver, which is a vital organ. You cannot live without it. The liver does many things for the body. It helps clean the blood. It produces bile, which is important in emulsifying fat in the digestive system. It is a lymphatic organ in that it checks for the presence of pathogens in the blood that comes to it via the hepatic portal vein from the stomach, the spleen, and large and small intestine. It also serves as the body's kitchen. It takes nutrient-rich blood that drains from the gastrointestinal system, and then that fuel that's in the blood in the form of monosaccharides or amino acids or fatty acids is either stored as fat or glycogen for later use for the body as energy, or it's passed on to the rest of the body through the hepatic vein and then into the circulatory system for use by the cells as fuel. It also creates the bile, which is stored here in the gallbladder, this little green organ under the liver. The bile in the gallbladder is there to emulsify fat. When food comes from the stomach into the small intestine, it travels down a tube that you can see here, the esophagus, which connects the pharynx to the stomach. As you swallow, the food enters the stomach through the upper opening here called the cardiac sphincter, so named because it's close to the heart. the food gets into the stomach secretes gastric juice, which helps to chemically break down the food that we eat. The churning of the stomach helps mechanically break down the food we eat, and then that food is introduced into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum, where the gallbladder and the pancreas will contribute secretions that will help to, in the case of bile, emulsify the fat. In the case of the pancreatic enzymes, chemically digest the food that's coming from the stomach into the small intestine. And then you can see here the small intestine, which is made up of three long regions: the duodenum, the first 10 inches, and then the longer areas, the jejunum and the ileum. And as the food travels through this long coiled pipe, what happens is that it's chemically broken down to the point where it can be absorbed directly into the blood. The proteins that we eat are chemically and mechanically broken down into amino acids. The polysaccharides that we eat are chemically and mechanically broken down into monosaccharides, and the fats that we eat are mechanically and chemically broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. The amino acids and the monosaccharides are absorbed into the bloodstream and they head to the liver, while the fats, the triglycerides, are absorbed into the lymphatic system, which is a network of vessels and organs throughout the body that helps to defend us against disease, and also absorb lipids, and lipids eventually rejoin the circulatory system, where they will eventually end up back at the liver. And of course, as we discussed earlier, the liver will either store this energy as fat or as glycogen for later use, or pass it on to the rest of the body to use as fuel. Surrounding the small intestine is the large intestine. It starts where the ileum meets the first part of the large intestine, the cecum, at the ileocecal valve. This now basically collection of waste products that comes from the small intestine will then go through the different parts of the colon: the cecum, the ascending, the transverse, the descending, and the sigmoid colon, and then out the rectum and the anus. Bacteria that live in this region will chemically break down our waste products and use those for fuel, and in turn provide useful components to the body, such as vitamin K and the B complex vitamins that are important in things like blood clotting and metabolism. You can see a little bit behind the small and large intestine. This is the bladder. This is the urethra. These are the inferior portions of the urinary system. The bladder, of course, stores liquid waste that comes to it from the ureters, which are connected to the kidneys. And the urethra, of course, conveys this liquid waste from the bladder out of the body. Okay, so those are just a few of the major organs that you can see just looking at the anterior view. And what we want to do next is sort of take a quick look at the organ systems of the body. We'll start with the integumentary system. Note that it provides protection from the outside world. You don't live in a sterile world. It's filled with things that could make you sick. So this provides protection against pathogens. It also regulates body temperature. For instance, on a hot day, you'll notice that your skin turns red and perspiration collects on the surface. As the sweat dries, it cools the skin, which in turn cools the blood, which in turn cools the body. It also produces vitamin D, which helps to mineralize bone. It's made up of the skin, the hair, the nails, and the sweat glands, and the sebaceous glands. The skeletal system provides structure and support. It's also a mineral storehouse, and it's the location of hematopoiesis. This is where the components of blood get made. The red and white blood cells are produced in the red marrow, which is found primarily in the bony thorax around here, the os coxa, which are the two hip bones and the heads of the femur, and also many of the flat bones of the body have a lot of hematopoietic tissue in them as well. Notice that the skeletal system does a very good job of protecting a lot of our vital organs. The brain is protected by the cranium, the spinal cord by the vertebral column, and the heart and the lungs by the bony thorax. And really the only vulnerable organs in the body are the abdominal pelvic organs, and this is probably due to the fact that man is one of the few creatures on earth that is bipedal. When we decided to stand up on two legs in order to improve our chances of survival, we exposed this vulnerable area. In tetrapods, animals that run around on all fours, you know, of course, that these soft parts are close to the ground and then, as a result, are reasonably well protected. So it's basically an accident of evolution that we haven't had some sort of anatomical adaptation to protect these vital organs here that really only have connective tissue and muscle as a shield between them and damage that might come from the outside world. The muscular system provides posture, generates heat and movement, and its main job really is to allow us to move around inside our environment. You can see here that the muscles and the skeletal system act together as the musculoskeletal system, and this provides structure and support and movement, the generation of body heat. It's made up of muscles, tendons, and ligaments that are attached to the skeleton. The ligaments attach bone to bone, the tendons attach muscle to bone, and of course the muscles have the unique property of producing movement. The lymphatic system is made up of several organs. You can see them here. The tonsils, which are stationed at the back of the pharynx, and this guards a port of entry known as the oral cavity against invasion by pathogens. You can also see scattered throughout the body, particularly in the axillary, the inguinal, the abdominal pelvic, the popliteal, and the supratrochlear regions, the lymph nodes. The lymphatic vessels in the lymph nodes filter body tissue and keep it relatively disease-free. When body tissue fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries, it eventually makes its way to lymph nodes, where specialized cells called macrophages will search that fluid for the presence of pathogens, things that could make us sick, will phagocytose them, basically eat them, chop them into little pieces, and display those little pieces on the surface of their cell membrane as a warning to the lymphocytes that we have something inside our system that's trying to make us sick. The lymphocytes will then mount an attack against that pathogen, knock it out, and then once we've destroyed it, we can turn the entire process back off. The thymus are where T lymphocytes mature and learn to fight disease. Moving down, the spleen is a major blood reservoir. It recycles red blood cells, and it's also a lymphatic organ in that the blood that comes to it is checked for the presence of pathogens by macrophages and lymphocytes in the same way that it happens in lymph nodes. And you can also see here stationed throughout the body thousands and thousands of these little P-shaped organs, these lymph nodes, and their main job again is the engulfing and the destruction and then the presentation on the surfaces of macrophages of antigens that come from pathogens as a warning to the lymphocytes that live in these organs that there's a pathogen inside the body trying to make us sick. And then, of course, this helps to alert the rest of the immune system to go out and fight the pathogen before it makes us ill. The respiratory system is important in the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the air. It regulates blood pH, and it consists of the lungs and the respiratory passages. The digestive system is the body's method of taking in chemical potential energy from the food that we eat and mechanically and chemically breaking it down into small enough components that we can absorb it into the bloodstream, send it from there to the liver, and then the liver can send it to the rest of the body. for use as fuel in order to make usable energy for the cell in the form of a molecule called ATP. It's made up of the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, both large and small, and the accessory organs, which include the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And of course, we can't leave out the stomach. The nervous system is one of the body's two communication networks. It sends and receives electrical signals. It allows us to react to our environment, and it's the integration of these signals from the environment in the brain that allows the brain to form commands that are sent from it to the brainstem, to the spinal cord, to the peripheral nerves, in order for us to act on our environment to help enhance our survival. The other major communication system in the body is the endocrine system, which is made up of endocrine glands stationed at strategic places throughout the body. You can see them listed here: the hypothalamus and pituitary, the pineal, the thyroid, the thymus, the adrenals, the pancreas, and of course the gonads. And this is a chemical communication system. Chemicals called hormones are secreted into the blood because endocrine organs are highly vascularized. We don't have far to travel generally to get these chemical signals into the bloodstream, and the beating action of the heart then carries them throughout the body. When they find cells with the appropriate receptor, they'll bind to those cells and cause them to do something in order to keep the body within a state of balance known as homeostasis, that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a bit. We should also point out, while we're here looking at these two communication systems, the major parts of the nervous system include the brain, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves, and you can see here. Moving on to the cardiovascular system, it's made up of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself. The blood vessels come in three broad categories. There are the arteries that always carry blood away from the heart, the veins that always carry blood back to the heart, and the capillaries, which is where the exchange of waste products for nutrients takes place, as well as the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And the purpose of the circulatory system is simply to deliver fuel and oxygen to the cells of the body so that they can make enough usable energy to live, and also to carry away waste products in the form of things like urea and ammonia and uric acid and carbon dioxide that, were they allowed to accumulate around cells, would generate toxic conditions that could cause the cells to die. The circulatory system came about because in a multicellular organism there are quite a few tissues and cells that are distantly removed from the respiratory system and the digestive system proper, and so in order for them to receive what they need to live, they have to have a delivery service and a waste removal service, and that's the primary job of the circulatory system. Other roles for the circulatory system are to maintain body temperature, to maintain body pH, and also to serve a protective role. The white blood cells, for instance, defend against disease. The red blood cells are the oxygen carriers, and the thrombocytes are involved in the formation of clots. The urinary system is made up of the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and urethra, and it's responsible for cleaning the blood, maintaining the pH of body fluids, maintaining blood volume and blood pressure, as well as the pH of the body fluids. It's vitally important. You can live without one kidney. You can't live without two. Over here you can see the male and female reproductive system, and of course these structures are important in generating new members of the species. We are sexually reproducing organisms, meaning that our offspring are a combination of genetic material, half of which comes from the male and half of which comes from the female. The utility of this is that the organisms that are produced are not carbon copies of either the mother or the father. This serves to increase biodiversity in the population, and the result of that is that as a species we're more likely to resist environmental challenges, because what makes one of us get sick or die doesn't necessarily have that same effect on the entire population. Whereas if every organism in a population were identical, what might make one of them sick or die may have the potential to kill all of them. It's made up of the gonads and the duct system. In the female, the gonads are the ovaries, the duct system are the fallopian tubes, the uterus and the vagina, and of course the mammary glands serve to nourish the infant once it's born. In the males, the gonads are the testes, and the duct system is made up of the seminiferous tubules, the rete testis, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, and the three parts of the urethra, which are the prostatic, the membranous, and the penile. Now, every living thing has certain characteristics that it has to possess in order for it to be considered living, and these include organization, which is a condition in which there are specific relationships and functions, metabolism, which encompasses all the chemical reactions within that organism, responsiveness, which is ability to change and adjust to the environment around it, and growth, which is an increase in the size and or number of cells, and development, which is the organism's changes that it exhibits over time. Differentiation is defined as a change from general to a specific role in the organism, whereas morphogenesis is a change in the shape of a tissue or an organ from a more immature to a more adult form. And then finally, reproduction is the process whereby we generate new organisms. Now, biomedical research is important because it helps us to study how living things function. And in this course, we're interested in how the human body functions. And so we take advantage of the fact that there is a unity in all of life. As a result, when we study living things, regardless of the type of living thing we study, there is going to be some ability to transfer the knowledge that we get from studying a simpler system to the human system. So this is a result of these shared characteristics. We can study biochemical processes that take place in some of the simplest organisms, such as bacteria, and this allows us to look a little bit at the cellular level and understand how, say, metabolic processes work, how genetic material works. We can step up to mammalian research, which will approximate the human condition a little more closely in order to study surgical techniques that we might use on humans and medicines that might be effective in treating human disease by either creating animal models of human disease or simply investigating the effects of drugs on healthy animals to determine whether they potentially could be harmful to human beings. As such, there are strict laws that govern research to minimize the suffering of animals. We don't want to subject these animals to undue duress in our pursuit of knowledge that can improve the human condition. Now, homeostasis is the body's internal balance. There are certain physiological parameters that need to be kept within a certain window. There's a ceiling above which these values cannot rise and a floor below which they cannot fall. If we deviate above the ceiling or below this floor, we create a condition called disease. And if we get too far outside this important range of values, we can produce death. So these values will fluctuate around a set point to establish a normal range of values. The set point is the ideal normal value of the variable. Here you can see an example of body temperature, where the set point is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 37 degrees centigrade. And you can see that if we look at body temperature over time, what it'll do is it'll rise and fall around the set point, but it won't get too far outside the ceiling, which is up here at 98.8, or below the floor, which is around here at 98.4. And the reason for that is that there are body systems in place designed to ensure that that doesn't happen, okay? And some of these body systems include the muscular system, the circulatory system, the digestive system, um, all acting together to try and maintain body temperature. As an example, let's take a cold day. Okay, on a cold day, if you didn't wear sufficient clothing, what you would observe would be a transient drop in body temperature. But before very long, you'd notice some physical and physiological responses that are going to be designed to try and bring your body temperature back up to normal. One thing you'll notice is peripheral vasoconstriction, where the blood is going to be directed away from the surface of the skin and towards the vital organs in an effort to keep you alive longer. And then after a while, what will happen is that you'll begin to shiver. And the point of this is to produce heat in a process known as thermogenesis. When the muscles contract and relax very rapidly, what this does is it hydrolyzes ATP, which is the body's energy currency, and one of the byproducts of that chemical reaction is heat. And what the heat does is to warm the body back up towards the normal set point. If you shiver too long, what will eventually happen is that your body temperature will rise above the set point and may even get up to um, close to the upper limit. And when that happens, the body will take steps to try and cool the body temperature back down. The skin will exhibit peripheral vasodilation. You'll begin to sweat. As the sweat dries, that'll cool the blood. As the blood cools, that'll cool the body. And as a result, our temperature will begin to drop back down towards the set point and then perhaps below it, and then the entire cycle would start again. So that's just an example of the body's attempt to try and maintain these variables within a nice tight range. And you might ask, okay, well, we know intuitively that if we get outside these parameters, we could get very sick or we could die, but why would that happen? Let's take the example of rising body temperature. How is it that rising body temperature could end up killing you? Well, if temperatures begin to climb too high, 98.8, 99, 101, eventually what will happen is that the chemical reactions that take place inside living systems will shut down because the biological catalysts that are called enzymes will begin to change their shape in such a fashion that they can't manage the chemical reactions that they're responsible for mediating. And when the chemical reactions inside cells stop, the cell will die. When the cell dies, eventually the tissues will die, and if enough of the tissue dies, eventually the organism will die. On the flip side, if we were to take the body temperature too low, what would happen is that the chemical reactions that keep us alive would slow down to the point that they wouldn't produce useful components for the cell quickly enough to keep the cell alive. And the result, again, would be that the cell would die, the tissue would die, the organ would die, the organ system would shut down, and eventually the organism would die. So we have to keep the body temperature within these nice tight ranges. And that's going to be true for any type of homeostatic response that we're examining. If the values get too high or too low, what you'll produce is a set of conditions incompatible with life, and eventually the series of events that leads to cellular death, to tissue death, to organ system death, to organism death will set in. So to maintain homeostasis, we have a couple of feedback systems that operate together in order to keep us happy and healthy. The two types are negative feedback and positive feedback, and they have components in common. These include a receptor that monitors the physiological value of some variable, and the control center, which establishes the set point, and the effector that can change the value of the variable. The stimulus is the deviation from the set point, which is detected by the receptor, and the response is produced by the effector. So as an example, we can look at a negative feedback loop regarding blood pressure. And We can start here with the receptors that monitor the conditions of blood pressure. Now, what is blood pressure? It's simply the force that the blood, the liquid, produces on the walls of the vessels that carry it. And if the blood pressure gets too high, the reason that that's bad for us is that that can produce undue strain on the most delicate blood vessels in the body, the capillaries, that can cause them to burst. If the capillaries burst, the tissues downstream of the break will be starved for oxygen and nutrients and they'll die. Okay, so that's why we have to keep the blood pressure um, below the ceiling, and the reason we have to keep it above the floor is because if blood pressure gets too low for too long, we're not going to deliver enough oxygen and nutrients to the cell to keep them alive, and the cells will die as a result of that. Okay, so this is a system designed to make sure that we keep the blood pressure within the physiological window. So the receptors monitor the blood pressure. They're located in vessels such as the aorta and the carotid arteries that supply blood to the brain. What happens if the blood pressure begins to rise too much is that there are nerve signals that will relay that information back to the brain stem. The brain stem will become aware of this stimulus and it will issue commands that will reduce now the rate and the force of contraction of the heart, and that will serve to drop the blood pressure. The slower the heart beats, the less pressure is produced in the system, the more the blood pressure will begin to drop. Okay, so that's one example of how a negative feedback loop works. The stimulus produces a change that will eventually cause that change to set back towards what the control center sees as the set point. So here the receptors are the aortic and carotid bodies. The control center here is the brain stem, and the effector in this case is the heart muscle. Here you can see an example of negative feedback, and what we're looking at here again is just the body's way of adjusting blood pressure as it either transiently rises or transiently falls. And we can start again here at number 1 block. You can see here blood pressure. Let's take the scenario where it's rising too high for the body to maintain that pressure for very long. What happens then is the blood pressure increases, homeostasis is thus disturbed. The receptors detect an increase in blood pressure, and the control centers in the brain decrease the stimulation of the heart and the blood vessels. What happens is the heart rate and the stroke volume drop, and the blood vessels will dilate. They have the ability to change their diameter based on these commands that come from the nervous system. As the diameter of the blood vessels go up and as the cardiac output goes down, the blood pressure will drop and we'll head back down towards now our physiological set point. Now if we drop too low, what will happen? Well, let's go here. Blood pressure drops too much, receptors detect a decrease in blood pressure, the control centers in the brain increase the stimulation of the heart and the blood vessels, so the heart's going to pump more quickly and it's going to squeeze harder every time that it pumps. The result is that the blood pressure will go up. Another thing that will happen is that the blood vessels will vasoconstrict. This will cause the blood pressure to rise, and the result is that the blood pressure will head back towards its physiological set point. Now, one of the things that we need to be aware of is the fact that these set points can vary depending, in the case of blood pressure, on our activity level. The more active you are, the more energy you're consuming. The more energy that you're consuming, the more energy we have to deliver to active tissue in order for it to keep alive. So it's not a surprise that the set point you can see here at rest, okay, for blood pressure is going to be lower than the set point that you see here during active exercise. And again, this is because we are more active, we're burning more energy, so we have to deliver more oxygen and nutrients in a shorter amount of time in order to keep not only the activity level up, but to keep the cells alive. And then once the exercise period is over, notice that normal blood pressure is restored, well, resting blood pressure is restored, and homeostasis now deviates around the new set point. Positive feedback is a different situation. Here, when the deviation occurs, the response is to make the deviation greater. It's unusual in normal, healthy individuals, and it tends to lead away from homeostasis and can result in death. An example of normal positive feedback is childbirth. In childbirth, what happens is that as the baby's getting ready to be delivered, the head comes out first in a normal birth. This will stretch the uterus. The stretching of the uterus will send nerve signals back to the brain, causing the secretion of a hormone called oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland under the command of the hypothalamus. Oxytocin has as one of its targets the smooth muscle of the uterus, and it will cause the smooth muscle of the uterus to squeeze. This causes the baby to crown even further. This stretches the uterus even further. The electrical signals feed back to the hypothalamus. More oxytocin is produced until what happens? Until the baby is delivered. And once the baby's out, the stretching of the uterine lining stops, the electrical signal to the brain stops, and the oxytocin production stops, and everything stops completely in terms of the positive feedback loop. An example of harmful positive feedback is the example of a hemorrhage. If you have a puncture wound or a laceration and you begin to lose massive amounts of blood, the blood pressure will drop, and this will cause the heart's ability to pump blood to drop as well. That will continue the drop in blood pressure to the point where if we don't do something about the blood loss, eventually there won't be enough oxygen and nutrients delivered to living tissue to keep you alive, and the result is that you'll die. Okay, what I want to do next is show you a little bit about positive and negative feedback in terms of the regulation of the female reproductive system. You'll learn more about this in A&P 2, but I thought it was a nice way to demonstrate how the body is able to communicate with itself in order to maintain certain physiological values that are conducive to keeping the entire organism alive. So take a listen.
During the menstrual cycle, before ovulation, small amounts of estrogen are secreted from the ovary. Estrogen stimulates the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone also stimulates release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone, in turn, causes release of additional estrogen from the ovary. The levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone increase in the blood due to this positive feedback effect. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed in the ovary and begins to secrete progesterone in response to luteinizing hormone. Progesterone inhibits the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Blood levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone decrease because of this negative feedback effect.
Okay, we'll pick up with the second half of Chapter 1 in the next podcast. And remember to review this material, to fill out your notes, and study them, because our first PRS quiz will begin with our second class meeting. It'll take place in the last 10 minutes, and it will be over the material that was covered in this podcast block. All right, so I look forward to seeing everybody in class, and have a nice evening. Talk to you later.